Hey, BGU students, Kenny Ortiz here. This is the second video that's a part of the lecture for February 24th. So February 24th was a day I was not able to be in class. This would be the second half of class. This would be the lecture for that class. On the last video, I ended by talking about Reconstruction. And so that's where we're gonna start in this video here. We're gonna start talking about this moment called Reconstruction. So when the Civil War ends in 1866, the Northern leadership, starting with Abraham Lincoln, and then after he's assassinated, it's after him. There is military force sent down, and basically the South is forced to disband their militias and their military, and the Northern military comes in and basically they function as the police officers. And so there's military Northern Union troops in every major town and in every region all across the South, just making sure that the South doesn't go back to doing the wickedness they were doing before. So there's all these new laws passed. So there's several amendments passed that eliminate slavery, that give Black people rights. There's all, it's kind of the first major civil rights movement in our country in the late 1860s and early 1870s. And you really have a lot of Black people that start to really kind of rebound. And so some don't. In some parts of the South, Black people end up as indentured servants. They end up living in extreme poverty. They're not officially slaves, but they might as well be because of the way they're treated and the horrific conditions they live. That's true in some parts of the South, but in other parts of the South, there is tremendous prosperity. And you have lots of Black people really being able to negotiate with their previous slave owners to be basically contractors, be hired. So they start basically starting their own mini businesses all over. They're entrepreneurs being hired by plantation owners. The North starts divvying up land and starts giving out land. And so you have lots of Black people start taking lease of pieces of land that was meant. You have Black owned businesses. You actually have several Black men that are elected to government at local and state levels, and even some federal posts and agencies they're a part of. By the time you get to the mid 1870s, there's this remarkable turnaround where Black people in the South, in many parts of the South, had tremendous opportunity and freedom. There are many Black people voting in elections, and there are Black men voting all across the South. There are even some parts of the South where Black women are allowed to vote. This is incredible. This is incredible progress. You've got lots of Black children going to school, learning to read and write. And in some places, they're going to school right alongside of white kids. There really is this looking forward to the future. And if Reconstruction had continued, and this had continued for an extended period of time, it is highly likely that race relations in America would not be the way they are today. This really is a moment where this is an opportunity. The tragedy is we squandered this opportunity, and race relations would get worse. And it's really sad. This is lamentable that this took place. And so some of you guys are reading Divided by Faith. Divided by Faith has alluded to this to some extent, this reality. And so Reconstruction takes place for a 10-year period. And then there's actual literal reconstruction taking place. So there's a bunch of buildings in the South that were, destroyed all over the place because of the war that took place. And there was this bloody war where buildings and whole cities were burned down and destroyed and, totally torn apart. And so there's a lot of reconstruction happening, but there's also political reconstruction, right? Where there's local governments in cities and in counties and at the state levels are being kind of revamped and reinvented and restructured, where local economy is being restructured. So Reconstruction is this monumental project that is wildly successful in a lot of ways. There are definitely some parts of Reconstruction that are broken. And there's a lot of corrupt politicians from the North that are able to kind of there's some business owners and corrupt people. They're able to kind of manipulate some of these moments for their own financial gain. And there's a lot of political corruption going on. And a lot of people in the South are getting angry that there's Northern politicians and Northern business owners that are making tons of money in the South. and they don't like it. And there's a lot of people in the South that owned plantations, that had owned slaves, that are resenting this. And a lot of them are losing money, and they're losing land, they're losing business opportunity, and they're watching black men rise to prominence and rise to prosperity in their communities. And they're watching their white kids go to school with black kids, and they're disgusted by this. And right, they're still racist. They still think that black people are inferior. And there's a pseudoscience that starts to get put out. For those of you who were with me in Sanctity of Life class, you know that eugenics starts to get popular in this era, and so, or the kind of the predecessor of pseudoscience to what would become eugenics starts to get popular. So there were all these myths about black people in the South being propagated, that black people are biologically inferior, that black people biologically want to be subdued and dominated by white people. There's all these fake, faux, scientific reports coming out, but they're actually a bunch of hogwash. You also have the hermeneutical problem, where you have Southern pastors, in some cases, using the Bible to basically say that white supremacy and slavery were okay, that the Bible endorses slavery, and that it was wrong for the North. So you have this groundswell of resentment from Southerners to the Northerners, but they couldn't do anything about it because there's Union troops on every corner everywhere, right? So they couldn't do anything about it. Well, fast forward to the election of 1876, which will go down in history as the most contentious and most corrupt election in American history. And if you're not familiar with the election of 1876, basically what happens is there's a Northern candidate and a Southern candidate. And Southerners were not allowed, anyone who had fought for the Confederacy originally were not allowed to hold office in some way. They were restricted from certain offices. But a lot of people who were still loyal to the old Confederacy were manipulating, trying to get someone who would be in office who would be more favorable and sympathetic to their beliefs and their causes, try to go back to the old ways, pre-Civil War. Well, in the election of 1876, it's a razor thin margin, but there's substantial evidence that both sides cheated. That in some of the elections on the West Coast, western part of the country, and in the North, there were some clear fraudulent faux election fraud. And then in the South, there was clearly some election fraud from both sides, the Southern Democrats and the Northern Republicans. And so this goes back and forth. And from November until March, we didn't know who the president would be. It's this massive back and forth. And it's not like the election of 2020 where Donald Trump was claiming that there's all this evidence the election was stolen. There's just not the case. In 1876, there was substantial, real, hard evidence that both sides had cheated significantly because they wanted to make sure their side won, because the South wanted to end Reconstruction and the North wanted to keep Reconstruction going. And so there ends up being this squabble for several months, and it goes to the Congress, and they're negotiating, and there's all these backroom deals. And finally, there's this thing called the Compromise of 1877. In March of 1877, finally, the delegates from the North and delegates from the South, they meet in kind of the secret backroom meeting, and they basically come to the conclusion that the Southerners in the South basically say, listen, we will relent and allow the Northern guy to become president if he promises to pull the bulk of the military troops out of the South. We'll continue Reconstruction policies. We'll continue doing these good things and giving black people opportunity, but we don't want the military breathing down our neck. We don't want military on every street corner. We want most of the military gone. And of course, you and I both know that these guys are lying. They're not going to continue these policies of the Reconstruction era. But the Northern Republicans relent because they figured, hey, at least we're going to get our president in. He's going to have power, and even if you pull the military out, the Northern guy can at least have some say-so over what's happening, because he'll still be a Republican president will be there. And so Rutherford B. Hayes is the guy that gets put into office, or was it Harrison? No, it was Hayes. Rutherford Hayes. Yeah, I should know this before I teach on it, right? Anyway, it doesn't matter who it was. The bottom line is the election of 1876 is the moment when, and after 1877, the new president comes in, and he immediately as promised, pulls the most of the military from the North out. And you can guess what happened. The Southerners started to implement again. And so the Southerners, after the election of 1876, this gives way to what we now refer to as the pre-Jim Crow era. And so the pre-Jim Crow cultural landscape was all the military are leaving, and now a lot of black people are nervous who's going to protect them. And in the late 1870s and early 1980s, late 1870s and early 1880s, the local governments, some of them actually they keep their word. And some of the local cities and local municipalities in the South, they do continue to allow black people to vote and hold office and prosper. And it's good. But there are other parts of the South where the plantation owners basically are able to get control of local government, and they start to basically harass black people. And they basically are the ones that start to really separate. And so it really starts with churches. And this is where evangelicals are really are part of being on the hook. A lot of Southern pastors, in particular Southern Baptist pastors, were promoting the idea that black people and white people shouldn't mix. And there was a concerted effort, and a lot of black people didn't want to worship with the white people as well. And so it became this. There was a concerted effort from both sides, but largely championed by white people. There needs to be a separation. And then there was this, let's separate the schools. Well, of course, once schools get separated, more money gets funneled to the white schools and less money gets funneled to the black schools. And then this idea of separating things starts to happen. And then local governments start making it harder for black people to own property. They start making it harder for black people to vote. They still could vote because they couldn't legally take away the right to vote, but they would do things. So they would have to pay a poll tax. And so it was a tax that was really high, and that they knew a lot of black people couldn't afford because they were living in poverty still. Most of them were still poor coming out of slavery. Or literacy was a role that you had to, when you go to vote, you had to read the Constitution and explain it. And a lot of black people didn't know how to read. And obviously if the black schools are getting less money and less resources, those kids are not really literate either. And so you can kind of keep black people down in this way. Now, of course, this affects a lot of poor white people as well. There was about 9 million people living in the South, about 9 or 10 million people living in the South. 5 million of them were poor white people that were illiterate, that are just as poor as black people. People forget. People think all the white people were rich. There was a lot of white people that were just as dirt poor as the black people were in the 1880s. And so a lot of those white people couldn't vote either in a lot of parts of the South. But in some parts of the South, the way they got around that was they passed what's called grandfather laws. And the law was if your grandfather could vote, then you could vote. And that's where the term grandfather in comes in. We still use that terminology in America today. And so even if you were a poor white person living in extreme poverty, you lived in the same poor conditions as a black person in the same town as you, and you were illiterate, but you could vote because your grandfather could vote or your great grandfather could vote, then you could vote. And so that was how many of them got around that. And so some parts of the South got really oppressive really fast in the 1880s and in the early 1890s. And some were not so oppressive. There was kind of a mix. In the bigger cities, it was not so bad. And in the more rural parts, it was really bad. And in some parts, it was kind of a mix. So it was very diverse. And there were a lot of people in the North in the 1890s saying, we have to do something about this. But there were just not a lot of people in the North that they didn't have the stomach to go to war again. It was just the idea of like, we fought this incredibly bloody war. And there was this tremendous financial instability and strain on the country. And the country had just come out of another financial burden in the 1880s. And as we're going into the 1890s, the country was just kind of restabilizing politically and financially. And there were a lot of people that just said, we don't want to fight another war. We don't want to do this. We just did that not too long ago. And it was devastating for our country. And a lot of people were just like, yeah, this is bad, what's going on. But it's just not worth the fight. That's what a lot of people in the North said in the 1890s, and basically allowed things to continue. And so there's a lot of political fighting about whether or not what's going on in the South is appropriate. And there are people in the South that are fighting the separation. They're saying, no, we shouldn't do this. We need to follow through with Reconstruction. So even amongst Southerners, there's major squabble going on. And the squabble really kind of ends with an event called Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. This is a monumental moment in American history. And so the city of New Orleans had they had a train system, this trolley system in the city of New Orleans, and they basically passed laws where were white train cars and black train car or colored train cars. So white people could ride one train car, colored people would ride another train car. That was the law. Because a lot of white people in Louisiana didn't want to intermix. They didn't want to be around black people because they were racist. Like, that was the bottom line. And they didn't want to be around. And they're hearing sermons on their Sunday morning, and they're going to church with all white people, and they're hearing sermons about how separation is good, how God meant the races to be separate. And if God wanted the races to be mixed, that he wouldn't have given us race. Like, those are the kind of sermons that were being promoted a lot in the late 1800s in churches in the South. And so there's a lot of white people in New Orleans and Louisiana saying, yeah, we don't want to ride train cars. I don't want to ride next to a black person. Interesting, though, a lot of black people were doing well financially in New Orleans in the 1890s. There were a lot of black people who had started businesses, and they they had jobs. And that's why they were riding the trolley from their homes into downtown New Orleans to work at the businesses that they were a part of. And there was a thriving black community in New Orleans in the 1890s. It was phenomenal. It's remarkable to think, 30 years earlier, they were slaves. They had nothing. And just within 30 years, they had this tremendous black community in New Orleans that was doing well. Not everyone, right? There was still lots of oppression and racism and people being treated harshly in parts of Louisiana, but there was one subculture doing well. And there's a guy named Homer Plessy who's a part of this community, but he's actually half white, half black, but he looks very white. Like, you're actually not sure. And so he actually intentionally, he and a group he's a part of, they want to fight this law, and they're trying to fight this law in public. And they realize that the only way to get this law challenged is for it to go to the Supreme Court of the United States. And they knew if they could get this to go to the Supreme Court and fight all the Supreme Court, they knew that the Supreme Court would vote in their favor, and it would actually outlaw all these separation laws nationwide. That was the idea. And so they file lawsuit, and they go, and they for several years they're going. So, this guy Plessy gets on the white train car. And when he's asked by an employee of the train company, what's your race? He goes, well, I'm colored. And so they arrest him. They say you have to get out the train car. He refuses. So they arrest him. And then he fights this law, and he was like, you have to pay a fine. And he said, I'm not going to pay it. And they said, we're going to throw you in jail. He's fine. Throw me in jail. And so over the course of several years, it looks like they're going to win this battle. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And it looks like they're going to win. And it looks like these separation laws are going to be dismantled across the South. But just like Dred Scott, and just like Buck v. Bell, and just like other moments, the Supreme Court, which we thought was going to, side in the right side, ends up siding with the wrong side. And the Supreme Court basically says Plessy actually broke the law, and that there's nothing wrong with separate laws, as long as it's separate but equal is what the Supreme Court says. They said it's perfectly legal for state governments and for local jurisdictions to pass laws to separate whites and blacks, so long as the equal. So you can't have 7 white train cars and 2 black train cars. You got to have 5 and 5, and you can't have 5 white train cars that are pristine condition and 5 black train cars that are in total disarray. You have to make effort to keep both of them up. Of course, it doesn't happen, but that's what the Supreme Court said you have to do. And in 1896, when this law comes down, the separate but equal doctrine, this really is a demoralizing blow to a lot of the people in the South that were against these separation laws. And many of them either just give up and they relent, or they flee to the North. And what ends up happening throughout the course of the late 1800s and into the early 1900s is you have a lot of the people who would have championed black civil rights in the South, they either give up or they flee to the North, which leaves the only people left in the South are all the racists who hate black people, who are in favor of these separation laws. And they start implementing these laws, which are known as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow is a nickname. It wasn't a real person. Jim Crow is a nickname for the idea of white supremacy. And there's a whole history to the name Jim Crow, which we'll talk about in a future lecture, future video. And so there's this these Jim Crow laws, these laws of separate but equal, start getting passed in the late 1890s in significant number. There had already been some, but states really feel emboldened. In the early 1900s, early 1910s, more and more and more of them start getting passed. And by the time you get to 1920, everything in the South is dramatically segregated, right? It starts in the late 1880s, and it starts, to trickle through the 1890s. After Plessy v. Ferguson, it just propels at a very rapid rate through the early 1900s. And this is the same era when the Ku Klux Klan is birthed, and white supremacy is really reborn and revitalized in the early 1900s. And there were many churches and Christian pastors, evangelical pastors, Southern Baptist pastors that championed segregation, that said segregation is a good thing. Segregation needs to be it's from the God is in favor of segregation, and that evangelicals were largely complicit in these things. And this is disgusting and lamentable. It's a part of our history, and we need to own it, and we need to repent of it. We need to lament that this is a part of history, and we need to take steps to try to fight against the ramifications of that we still deal with today in 2021. So that's Plessy v. Ferguson leads to the Jim Crow and the segregation South. So from the 1890s all the way into the 1960s, segregation is the way of the world, and strong systemic racism is the way of the world in the United States of America, all the way into the 1960s, the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement in the 1860s is really the moment, that there's lots of moments in the 1850s. Brown v. Board of Education is a Supreme Court case, which, thank God, overturns Plessy v. Ferguson, basically saying separate but equal is not an acceptable doctrine to use in political ideology. So that gets overturned. So that's one of the starts. You have Rosa Parks refusing to sit at the back of the bus. You've got lots of things taking place. You got some protests and some moments of violence and riots breaking out in different parts of the country. And then, of course, you have Dr. Martin Luther King coming to the forefront, and we'll talk more about him in a future lecture as well. And the civil rights movement largely is propelled through the 1960s. The majority of systemic racist laws are outlawed and overturned throughout the 60s. You have dramatic changes in the laws and culture. You have a few more in the early 1970s. And then in 1975, you have the outlawing of redlining. Redlining is this thing where banks would draw red lines around certain neighborhoods, predominantly black neighborhoods, and refuse to loan money to people living in those areas. So it really inhibited black people from owning homes and prospering throughout the 20th century. And so with the outlawing of redlining in 1975, that really is kind of the last official law or statute that is overtly systemically racist. And that gets eliminated. And so praise God that now in 2021, there is no such thing as institutional racism anymore in America. When I say that, what I mean is there are no official laws or statutes or protocols that are overtly designed to keep black people down and to stop black people. However, we do have the vestiges and the ramifications of institutional racism that existed for a long time. So you have overt institutional racism from 1619 until 1860s. And then again from the 1880s until 1975. And there are ramifications of that, right? There are still implications. There are leftover effects that still affect us today because of that. So even though we've gotten rid of those old racist laws, doesn't mean there's no more impact. It doesn't mean like, okay, racism is gone. No, like there's still residual impact. There's still residual ramifications that still are still festering. and still are spilling over, and will probably continue to fester and spill over for an extended period of time. And I do believe there will come a moment in American history where those the ramifications and implications of those old laws are no longer spilling over. But unfortunately, 2021 is not yet. We can hope and we can pray and we can work toward that ends. That would be amazing, but we're not quite sure. We're not quite there yet. So, all right. So that's pretty much where we're at current time. And then the last thing I'll mention in this video, if those of you who are reading Divided by Faith book, you've read about how many modern evangelicals, white evangelicals in particular, are resistant to jump into the fight. Many white evangelicals are resistant to fight against or to even talk about the residual impacts of institutional racism that existed for decades and decades in our country. And there's a lot of reasons why. The Smith and Emerson textbook, they talk about that in their textbook, about the reasons why that is. There's a lot of different reasons why that is, and we'll talk about that more and more in future weeks and future lectures. It's a tragic reality that many white evangelicals basically deny that there's any residual impact of institutional racism of previous generations. And until we acknowledge it, we really can't fight those ramifications. And so that's my exhortation to you, no matter what your race is to prayerfully consider how might you be able to help fight against some of the vestiges and leftover ramifications and residual impact of the racist positions and racist policies of the past. So by God's grace, by God's wisdom and by his providence, we'll be able to navigate those things and work towards getting rid of all of those residual impact for future generations. By God's grace, we'll get there. But it starts with us acknowledging it and actually working against those things, working to fight in favor of fighting against, or you know what I mean. We got to acknowledge it. We actually got to do something. We can't just talk about it. Is my point. We can't just talk. We have to actually join the fight. We have to actually get into in the conversations that lead to real action against the vestiges and ramifications of slavery and Jim Crow era laws.